Howdy, folks. My name is Will Watson, and I'll be doing the March Public Forum topic analysis on Resolve. The Republic of India should sign the Artemis Accords for Champion Briefs. Champion Briefs provides a wonderful service for debaters of all skill levels, whether you're just trying to get familiarized with the arguments or preparing for a big tournament. I'm sure that the brief can help you. A little bit about me. I got my master's in international affairs from the Bush School of Government and Public Service, and my bachelor's in international studies with a minor in Russian from Texas A&M University. I'm particularly pleased to be speaking to you about this topic because I had the pleasure of focusing some of my graduate research on the Artemis Accords, along with some of the other space treaties. So let's dive into it. Today we're going to briefly analyze some of the background of the treaty. We're going to look at the main pro and con arguments, and then we're going to do some framework and some round predictions. When we're getting into the background here, the first thing that I note is that this is a policy topic. It says should, and that will always indicate it's a policy topic, which means that there will be a change to the status quo. A change to the status quo guarantees that there will be easy two-world analysis for both sides, where the pro would be the adopting of the resolution, and the con would be a world in which India does not sign the Artemis Accords, which is the status quo. I tend to be a fan of policy topics, but in public forum, be advised you cannot write a plan or a counterplan, making it a little more difficult. So we're going to go over how you can skirt around those rules while still acting in the spirit of the competition. This also is an international affairs topic with some treaty language. The one thing that you always need to think of whenever you hear a treaty is it's going to be about sovereignty. Every treaty requires a nation to give up a portion of sovereignty, whether they're giving up sovereignty to some of their economic issues, such as the EU, some of their defense issues, such as NATO, some of their intelligence sharing issues, like the Five Eyes. You see that a lot of countries are willing to give up a significant portion of their sovereignty and their ability to execute decisions in an independent manner in order to get the added benefits of a treaty. The Artemis Accords are no different, and we're going to go over why. A key source that I used in preparing this research, if you type in India and the Artemis Accords by Aditya Ramanthan, and a few other researchers, it was a phenomenal starter article to get me generating some good ideas for the pro and con arguments. Highly recommend you start your research there. So with the background, let's begin by looking at what are the Accords. The Accords are an 18-page document, which means that it is well within your capabilities to read the entirety of the Accords and familiarize yourself top to bottom with the language. It was announced in October of 2020, and to quote the Accords, the purpose of these Accords is to establish a common vision via a practical set of principles, guidelines, and best practices to enhance the governance of civil exploration and use of outer space with the intention of advancing the Artemis program. That brings up the first of many ideas, which is it advances the Artemis program. In order to be a part of the Artemis program, you have to sign the Artemis Accords, and we'll get into what that is. The United States was the one who launched the Artemis Accords with the idea of making it so space is a little bit easier to explore. The United States wants to establish a space framework with the United States at the helm of that framework, and we can get into some of the reasons why that's beneficial from a U.S. perspective a little bit later on. One of the key notes that the Accords makes is the principles set out in these Accords are intended to apply to civil space agencies conducted by the civil space agencies of each signatory. There are currently a lot of signatories. I'll go through them real quick for you. There's Australia, Bahrain, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, France, Israel, Italy, Japan, Luxembourg, Mexico, New Zealand, Nigeria, Poland, Republic of Korea, Romania, Rwanda, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Ukraine, the UAE, the UK, and the US. Take a quick second before progressing any further in this video and read the Accords. Hopefully you've read them by now, but if not, feel free to pause and go back. Couple of key knowledge points from the Accords, but this topic is about space. If you haven't got that by now, it's important that you do, that you're going to be looking at the benefits and the cons of increased space exploration and space cooperation. This is a topic that's gone back since the Cold War. How do we govern space? How do we explore space? Should we commercialize space? Should we put weapons in space? And the Artemis Accords addresses a lot of these key areas. One of the first major treaties to try to address this was the Outer Space Treaty, which has, according to the Wikipedia page on the Outer Space Treaty, 112 signatories, including all the major spacefaring nations such as the US, Russia, and China, and India. All of these countries have agreed to abide by the Outer Space Treaty. But there's a bit of a gray area between the Outer Space Treaty, the Artemis Accords, and Russia and China's view of the issue. That's because the Outer Space Treaty clearly states that outer space is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, the means of use of or occupation, or by any other means. Take that in a vacuum and look at national appropriation. That means the US government could not claim the moon. Doesn't say anything about SpaceX going up and claiming the moon, though. And that is where the topic is going to diverge, because this topic is really about should we or should we not commercialize space through private companies? Because Russia and China say no, the US and the signatories of the Artemis Accords say yes, and India is stuck in the middle and needs to make a difficult decision. The United States has long argued that private partnerships in outer space is A-OK, and private ownership of outer space is okay. In 2015, the U.S. Congress passed H.R. 2809, the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act, allowing private companies to use resources from the moon and celestial bodies like asteroids. I believe President Trump passed an executive order also advocating for the commercialization of space, giving private companies the enterprise to go ahead and commercialize space. For those of you who don't know, space has a lot of natural resources. There are some scholars who argue that a large truckload of helium-3 from the moon could be a critical resource in solving some of our energy problems. There are rare earth minerals on asteroids out there, and there's the idea that we need to just get off the rock, that we need to get off of Earth because man-made or anthropogenic problems, such as climate change, have become to the point that we're not going to be able to survive. So why would we continue living on a planet that may not be livable when there are other planets out there? All of these ideas are questions that debaters need to be asking themselves. Let's look at some of the key benefits of the Accords. I'm going to list the benefits that are listed in the Accords, and I think you can make some good pro cases just out of this. First is interoperability. Especially with things like fuel, we should make it where one ship can use another ship's parts and that we're able to go ahead and have that exchange. Emergency assistance. If you haven't read the book The Martian, it's a phenomenal read, and one of the concepts there is that countries should try to go to the aid of other countries' citizens, even if there are other countries' citizens in outer space. So trying their best to assist worldwide. Registering space objects. Space debris are a major problem. Imagine a thing the size of a small flecket piece of sand that's traveling at 27,000 miles per hour around the Earth. That hits a satellite, that could severely damage the satellite. Space debris is a problem, but it's not just the tiny specks. It's also satellites that have been decommissioned or satellites that have broken apart in orbit. There are now certain procedures that a lot of companies like SpaceX have to follow before launching a satellite to show that they're going to decommission it by crashing it into the ocean instead of having it where it explodes in orbit, which would create more space debris. There's also an idea that if one satellite crashes into another, it would create a domino effect, where the satellites crash into each other, then the debris crash into another satellite, and so on and so forth. So we want to minimize space debris. which is helpful by registering space objects. The Artemis Accords says that we should share scientific data. Scientific diplomacy has been a tenet of U.S. soft power hegemony for a long time, where we want to have the scientific exchanges between two nations in order to properly expand our national horizons. By exchanging ideas, we can progress further as a species. We can go ahead and achieve things that we couldn't achieve in the vacuum. So we want to promote scientific data. The next idea is preserving outer space heritage. That a lot of the stuff that we did in space is frankly incredible, and we want to preserve it. The next area the Accords talks about are space resources. It says that the U.S. should, or excuse me, not the U.S., but the spacefaring nations should try to get the resources out of space. That this could solve a lot of problems. Then there's the deconfliction of space activities, trying for peace there, and then it talks about orbital debris. So those are the benefits listed in the Accords, but let's take a breath and look at what this topic is asking us to analyze, which is how do these benefit India? Well, India has wanted to go to the moon and have Indian cosmonauts or astronauts on the moon. India wants to be a part of this exploration and wants to be a part of the scientific achievement, and signing on to the Artemis Accords would be a great way for India to go ahead and achieve this. There's an idea that if India does not sign on to the Artemis Accords, India could be left in the dust, where the United States and its allies will be able to further progress, and China, Russia, and their allies will be able to further progress, and India's stuck in the middle and not progressing as it should. It's debatable whether or not India would be able to significantly expand its space resources without other nations' activities. The U.S. is a lead producer in aerospace material. I know Luxembourg has been doing significant research in their satellite programs. I believe some of the other signatories as well have been doing amazing things in outer space. The question is, will India jump on the bandwagon and go for it? With the idea of space resources could benefit a lot of nations. Rare earth minerals are critical to make renewable energy, such as solar panels and wind turbines. With that, we could go ahead and see a greener future through space resources. But the pros should go ahead and argue that it's key for India to sign on. India has a massive population. Having it where we get a country like India on the Accords would be huge. Space diplomacy is another key area that I think pro-debaters should look at. India would be able to closely align itself with the Western world order, and go ahead and ally itself with the U.S. and its allies, which would put India in a better boat. I think the pro can frame this as a benefit to India, especially when it has a border dispute with China and Pakistan, that India could be able to align itself with a powerful hegemon. That may be beneficial for India. With that, let's go and look at some of the key harms. The first key harm is space resources. There's a lot of theory out there that if we start mining outer space, it's the first step toward really militarizing outer space. If you look at a history of some of the wars the U.S. has fought in, none of these occurred without economic consequences. And some of them were even started because of economic issues. The military, in my humble opinion, exists to serve the country, serve its citizens, and protect its citizens. But more than that, a military is the first safeguard for the economy. Whenever we look at things like piracy, the U.S. military has stepped in, specifically the Navy, to address some piracy situations. It's the military can safeguard the economy, which is why in outer space, forgive the silliness here, but if we were to have space pirates, we would need the military to step in and help, which is, I think, a key area of this topic. That do we want an environment where space could be militarized, and all of a sudden we're potentially having a space war? I think that'll be the majority of the cons offense, that we should not fight for resources in space, that we're fighting enough for resources here. I think the pro has a great front line against that, that is to call it non-unique and say, you're absolutely right, we're fighting for resources here. Maybe we could try or die to go into space and get resources there. It'd be really interesting to see how these arguments play out. The other major con is angering Russia and China because as the US announced the Artemis Accords, Russia and China announced the International Lunar Research Station. Russia and China want to get to the moon. They want it just as much as the US does. And so they're going to fight to get to the moon and get more signatories for their side than we want for the Artemis Accords. According to Pradeep Mohandas, writing on The Wire in 2021, India has existing significant ventures with Russia and China. It's possible that signing the Artemis Accords puts those ventures in jeopardy. Additionally, by signing the Artemis Accords, India may be hamstrung to the United States and have to follow the United States path instead of a path that would most benefit India. Dr. Ajay Lely writes on this. He's a senior fellow at the MP IDSA, New Delhi, writing for Financial Express in 2021 that the Artemis Accords could draw India's focus too much toward the moon instead of on its own space priorities. For those of you looking for the link, it's spelled AJEY space LELE. There's also been some major criticism of the dispute resolution mechanisms in the Artemis Accords, with people saying that it's not enough, that it doesn't have enforcement principles. So I think it'd be critical for debaters to bring up all of these things, but especially the space resources. Y'all, there is so much evidence out there for this topic, but let's take a step back and look at framework. A lot of you experienced debaters will recognize what I'm about to say, but for new debaters, because India is the actor in this topic, there's a lot of rationale for making all of the arguments impacting back to India rather than other nations. It would be extraordinary for the US to do something which was completely separate to US interest. Often the US does humanitarian projects, but also those closely align with US interest, usually. I think that framing the topic as resolved, the Republic of India should sign the Artemis Accords, observation one. All impact should tie back to India as they're the actor in this. Two reasons why. First, because this is policy making. We should act as policymakers from other countries, not just as the United States, in order to get a worldwide perspective. And second, because of fairness, it would be very difficult and probably not fair to go ahead and assume that we should take anyone else's interest ahead of the country that's acting. I think you can make that framework argument really, really strong. I see, looking into my magic ball here, I see some good debates on this topic. I see a heavily contested resource debate where I think the pro is going to argue collecting space resources good. Con is going to argue collecting space resources bad. The pro comes back and says no, collecting space resources is good and necessary to avoid war. The con comes back and says actually space resources cause war and Artemis doesn't have the dispute resolution. I think the con could have a major advantage by generating not a counterplan, but a disadvantage that solves the majority of the affirmatives offense. What I mean by that is taking the idea that India signing on to its own path or India signing on with Russia and China would be able to give it some of the diplomatic power that it needs to capture a lot of the pros ground. Or the India just doesn't sign on to the Artemis Accords, but then does private enterprise partnerships with the United States. That, hey, we don't want to do these accords, but instead we're more than willing to do this. I think if you look at some of the existing space action India has going for it, some of the existing partnerships, the cons first cross can just be, wait a second, you tell me that the benefits of the Artemis Accords are this, this, and this. Doesn't this current activity speak to that benefit? And you're generating a lot of offense right out in cross, which I know a lot of debaters struggle with. In conclusion, I like this topic. I like this topic more than a lot of other topics recently. I think that y'all are going to have some great rounds on this topic. I really look forward to seeing what you can do. Everyone, have a great day. Have a happy March. Take care.